Jesus was dead by 3 p.m. on Thursday. His family and his followers were in utter shock. None of them could believe that God would have allowed Jesus, the Davidic Messiah and legitimate King of Israel, to die. There were no preparations for his burial. Jesus' family was from Galilee and owned no family burial cave in Jerusalem. The sun was beginning to set, and the Passover meal would begin at nightfall. Something had to be done quickly with Jesus' corpse, lest the family suffer the shame of having it left on the cross overnight. The Gospels relate that Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy and influential member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, intervened to help. Joseph went to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, and using his influence and status as a member of the Sanhedrin, got permission to remove Jesus' body from the cross and temporarily bury him. He enlisted the help of a man named Nicodemus, also a member of the Sanhedrin, who shared his sympathetic view of the Messianic movement. The problem they faced was where to temporarily bury Jesus in such pressing circumstances. It is commonly assumed that the tomb in which they placed Jesus that late afternoon belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. That was not the case. Mark and Luke just say, they took the body and laid it in a tomb hewn out of the rock. The Gospel of John supplies an additional important detail. In the place where Jesus was crucified was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one was ever yet laid. It suited the emergency situation that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus faced. They could temporarily put the corpse of Jesus inside, and after the Passover and Sabbath holidays, the family could return and give Jesus his proper funerary rites. Jesus' mother Mary and her companion Mary Magdalene followed Joseph and Nicodemus to the tomb, noting carefully its location. There was no time to prepare the body for burial according to the traditional Jewish custom, which included washing and anointing the corpse and applying various spices and perfumes to control the odor of decay. Joseph and Nicodemus simply wrapped the body in a linen shroud and laid it out on a stone slab as a temporary resting place. They blocked up the small entrance to the tomb with a stone, cut for that purpose, to keep out animals or strangers who might happen by. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre now encloses the traditional site of Golgotha and the tomb where Jesus' body was placed. In the time of Jesus, it was a rock quarry, barely outside the Herodian city wall on the northwest. It has become the holiest site in Christendom. Protestants generally prefer a location outside the walls of the old city, just north of the Damascus Gate, called Gordon's Calvary, or the Garden Tomb, next to the modern city bus depot in East Jerusalem. There tourists find an elevated rock outcropping whose craggy surface is said to resemble a skull, and since Golgotha means place of the skull, many have become convinced it is the right location. There is a garden there with a tomb that is said to be the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. The authenticity of either site is problematic. The tomb at the Protestant site has been dated to the Iron Age or 5th century BC, which is much too early to fit the description of a newly hewn tomb. The Catholic site is based on traditions from the 4th century, a full 300 years after Jesus' crucifixion. A more likely site for Jesus' crucifixion is on the Mount of Olives east of the city, overlooking the temple compound. One of our earliest sources remembers Jesus' crucifixion as outside the camp. The technical expression outside the camp was interpreted as a distance of at least 2,000 cubits, which is about half a mile, east of the temple sanctuary. It was there toward the summit of the Mount of Olives where certain purification rituals were performed and criminal penalties were carried out. There was also an attempt in the 1st century AD to locate tombs outside this perimeter to avoid ritual defilement of the temple. This suited the Roman purposes well, since they preferred to stage crucifixions on hills by main roads so that the population would see the punishment and take heed. We are not told where Jesus' family and the core group of his followers ate the Passover meal the evening of Jesus' death, but one can only imagine the sad and solemn occasion it must have been. They probably would have gathered in the home of Mary and Martha at Bethany on the Mount of Olives, where Jesus and his followers had been staying that entire week. They must have been terrified that others of their group might be arrested. The shock of Jesus' death would have been all that was on anyone's mind. Trying to determine what happened next is probably the most difficult and controversial topic in the study of Christian origins. The standard Christian proclamation is well known, that Jesus was raised from the dead, that he appeared to many witnesses, and that he ascended into heaven where he sits as the glorified Christ at the right hand of God. But this familiar message, packaged in this way, was a long time coming. 3 facts appear to be indisputable. First, that Jesus was truly dead. Second, that he was hastily and temporarily buried in an unknown tomb. And third, that the movement Jesus began did not end with his death, but revived and found new life under the leadership of Jesus' brother James. All 4 New Testament Gospels report that the tomb in which Jesus was temporarily placed was found empty on Sunday morning. But they don't agree as to who arrived first at the tomb and what subsequently transpired. The Gospel of John says that Mary Magdalene went alone, without the others, even before sunrise when it was still dark, and she was the one who found the stone blocking the entrance removed and the body missing from the slab where it had been placed late Thursday afternoon. She immediately ran back into the city to find Simon Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, exclaiming, "They've taken away the Master out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." The Gospel of John goes on to say that Simon and the unnamed disciple ran all the way to the tomb to verify the report. All they found were the linen wrappings that had been put around the corpse. Jesus' body was gone. No one leaped to any conclusion about Jesus being raised from the dead. At that point, it was a matter of a missing corpse. Mark says that Jesus' mother Mary, Salome, and Mary Magdalene went together to the tomb, and instead of seeing Jesus, they encountered a young man who told them, "Do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He is risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him." According to Mark, they fled from the tomb in amazement and said nothing to anyone. Matthew reports that Jesus' mother and Mary Magdalene went together to the tomb. There was a great earthquake, and an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and rolled away the stone, telling them, "Jesus is not here, he is risen." Luke says that they found the stone already rolled away, went in the tomb, saw that there was no body, and were perplexed. Suddenly 2 men in dazzling apparel appeared and said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" Some have suggested that Jesus might not have been clinically dead, but that he fell into some type of comatose state from which he subsequently recovered. This idea, commonly referred to as the swoon theory, has many variations, including the idea that Jesus might have plotted the whole thing, having himself drugged so that he could suffer as Israel's Messiah but escape death. Various fantastic theories have emerged based on this idea. One idea is that Jesus traveled east to India in search of the lost tribes, where he eventually died, with his grave now located in the city of Srinagar in Kashmir. Another idea that has cropped up in recent years in several popular books is that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, and that after surviving the cross, he moved with her and their child to live out their lives in the south of France. One modern author has even argued that Jesus traveled east, but then returned to Palestine to join the Jewish revolt, and subsequently died at Masada in 73 AD. None of these theories appear to have any basis whatsoever in reliable historical sources. I think we need have no doubt that given Jesus' execution by Roman crucifixion, he was truly dead, and that his temporary place of burial was discovered to be empty shortly thereafter. 3 of our 4 New Testament Gospels report sightings of Jesus to support the idea that he'd been raised from the dead: Matthew, Luke, and John. But what about Mark? As shocking as it may sound, the original manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark report no appearances of the resurrected Jesus at all. Mark, our earliest Gospel source, ended his Jesus story with the empty tomb. Period. The last verse of Mark's Gospel originally read, "And they, the 2 Marys and Salome, went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had come upon them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." I say originally read because, for obvious reasons, such a shockingly abrupt and incomplete ending could not be allowed to stand. What happened was that pious scribes who copied Mark made up an ending for him and added it to his text sometime in the 4th century AD, over 300 years after the original text was composed. What Mark's original text tells us is that the reports of Jesus appearing to various individuals and groups after his resurrection were not considered a necessary part of the gospel story around 70 AD when Mark was written. So how did such reports develop? Actually, our earliest account of sightings of Jesus is not in the New Testament Gospels, but in the letter of Paul we call 1 Corinthians, written around 54 AD. In the course of defending his own vision of Jesus, Paul reports that he had received the tradition and passed it on to his converts, that Jesus died, was buried, and rose on the 3rd day. According to Paul, Jesus appeared first to Cephas or Peter, then to the 12, then to 500 disciples at one time, then to James, brother of Jesus, then to all the apostles, and finally, last of all, he appeared to me. Paul equates his own sighting of Jesus, which was clearly visionary, with those of the original founders. What the Gospels claim about Jesus is that the tomb was empty and that his body was revived to life, wounds and all. But Paul seems to be willing to use the term resurrection to refer to something akin to an apparition or vision. What we have to realize is that the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John were written between 40 to 70 years after the death of Jesus by authors who were not original witnesses and who were not living in Roman Palestine. By that time, the proclamation of the resurrection of Christ had become the fundamental cornerstone of the emerging Christian faith, and Paul's version of the story had largely triumphed. The church was removed in time and place from its Jerusalem roots. James was dead and on the way to being forgotten. Even Peter and Paul were dead, though they were remembered as heroes and founders of the Christian faith. That does not mean these Gospels contain nothing of historical value, but it does mean their purpose in reporting the empty tomb story and the sightings of Jesus is to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus Christ and his death for the salvation of all humankind. It may be that John's account offers us our best clue as to what might have happened to Jesus' body. If Mary Magdalene did in fact go very early to the tomb alone, and it was already empty, someone else must have come before she arrived and moved the body. One is left to guess here, but the most likely possibility would be his mother Mary and his sister Salome, and perhaps the sisters Mary and Martha with whom they were staying. Mark says that after sundown on Saturday, when the Sabbath was over, they bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. Since Jesus' body had been rushed to a temporary tomb because of the Passover holiday, it makes sense that the family would complete Jesus' final burial as soon as possible. Washing and anointing the naked body of a loved one was an intimate act of devotion. They might have moved him at dusk Saturday night, taken him to a permanent tomb somewhere in Jerusalem, and prepared the body for burial according to Jewish custom. If we trust John's account, for some reason Mary Magdalene was not present and showed up early Sunday morning before dark only to find the tomb already empty. We can assume that eventually there was a Jesus family tomb somewhere in Jerusalem, since the Jesus movement, led by James, his brother, eventually reestablished itself there. We have a tradition that James was buried in the Kidron Valley, just below the Mount of Olives. There's also a tradition that Jesus' brothers later buried Mary, their mother, near the place where Jesus had been crucified. This area on and around the Mount of Olives, and just a bit south where the Kidron and Hinnom valleys intersect, or further south in Talpiot, seems to fit our best evidence.